The convoy never saw it coming. On a frozen morning in 1943, somewhere in the mountains of Nazi-occupied Norway, 15 German military trucks, loaded with ammunition, supplies, and soldiers, began their descent down a winding road that hugged the edge of a cliff. The drivers followed the arrows on the traffic signs, the same signs they had trusted for weeks. But on this particular morning, those arrows were lying. One by one, the trucks turned exactly where the signs told them to turn. And one by one, they sailed off the edge of a 200 ft drop into a ravine filled with jagged rocks and frozen water. The screams were swallowed by the wind. The explosions echoed through the valley. And the person responsible for this devastation was not a commando, not a spy, not a hardened resistance fighter. He was a 15-year-old Boy Scout. This is the story they buried in the footnotes of World War II. While history remembers the beaches of Normandy and the factories of the Ruhr Valley, it forgot the small acts of sabotage that happened in the shadows of occupied Europe, carried out by teenagers who were supposed to be learning knots and camping skills. The name of this boy has been lost to time, scrubbed from official records by a combination of Nazi retaliation fears and post-war embarrassment. But the deed itself, confirmed by Norwegian resistance archives and German military logs, remains one of the most audacious and simple acts of rebellion in the entire war. By the time you finish this video, you will understand how a child with nothing but courage and a wrench managed to kill more enemy soldiers in a single morning than some entire resistance cells did in a year. Norway in 1943 was a frozen prison. The country had fallen to the Wehrmacht in 1940, conquered in a blitzkrieg campaign that lasted just 2 months. The Nazis needed Norway for its coastline, its ports, and its route to the iron ore mines of Sweden. They occupied every major city, installed puppet governments, and turned the Norwegian countryside into a surveillance state. Checkpoints appeared on every road. Curfews locked families inside their homes. Quisling, the Norwegian traitor who gave his name to collaboration itself, ruled from Oslo while the real power sat in Berlin. For the average Norwegian family, life became a series of small humiliations and large fears. Food was rationed, radios were confiscated. Speaking against the Reich meant a one-way trip to a labor camp or a bullet in the woods. But in the rural mountains, far from the eyes of the Gestapo headquarters, life moved at a different pace. Small villages clung to the hillsides, connected by narrow roads that twisted through pine forests and along cliff edges. These roads were the arteries of the occupation. Every day, German convoys moved supplies from the coast to the interior, feeding the machine of control. The locals watched these convoys pass with silent hatred. But what could they do? The soldiers had machine guns. The villagers had farming tools. Resistance seemed impossible. That is what made the Boy Scouts so dangerous. They were invisible. They were underestimated. And they knew every inch of those mountain roads better than any German officer ever could. The boy in this story lived in one of those villages, a cluster of wooden houses that probably held fewer than 200 people. His father worked in the local mill. His mother tended a small garden that barely produced enough to survive the rationing. Before the war, he had been a member of the local scout troop, spending weekends hiking the trails and learning wilderness survival. When the Germans arrived, the scout troops were officially disbanded. The Nazis feared any organization that taught young people independence and resourcefulness. But the boys kept meeting in secret in barns and forest clearings, and the lessons continued. They learned to move without sound. They learned to read the land. And most importantly, they learned that the Germans, for all their efficiency and brutality, were strangers in these mountains. They relied on the roads. They trusted the signs. And that trust, the boy realized one winter night, could be turned into a weapon. The idea came to him while watching a convoy pass through the village square. He noticed how the drivers never hesitated at the intersections, never stopped to confirm their route. They simply followed the arrows painted on the wooden traffic signs. These signs were not sophisticated. They were not guarded. They were just pieces of wood nailed to posts pointing left or right, up or down, and they were absolutely critical. One wrong turn on these mountain roads did not mean a detour. It meant death. The cliffs dropped straight down into valleys where no rescue was possible. The boy understood that if he could change just one sign at just the right intersection, He could send an entire convoy to its doom. The risk was enormous. If he was caught, the Germans would not just kill him, they would execute his entire family as a warning. But the opportunity was perfect, and the anger burning inside him, the anger of watching his country suffer under the boot of the Reich, was stronger than his fear. The plan formed slowly over several weeks as winter deepened and the convoys kept rolling. The boy began to study the German routes with the focus of a general planning a campaign. He would wake before dawn and position himself in the forest overlooking the main road hidden among the pines, watching which convoys traveled at what times. He noticed patterns. The supply trucks always moved on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. They traveled in groups of 10 to 20 vehicles. They moved fast, trying to cover as much distance as possible before nightfall made the mountain roads even more treacherous. Most importantly, he identified the critical intersection, a fork in the road about 5 miles outside his village, where one path continued safely along the ridge, and the other curved sharply toward what the locals called Devil's Drop, a cliff that fell 200 ft straight down into a gorge filled with rocks and ice. The Germans always took the safe route. The sign at that intersection pointed them away from danger. But that sign was just wood and nails, and the boy had both a wrench and a death wish for the occupiers. The risk was not just in changing the sign. The risk was in everything that surrounded it. The Germans patrolled these roads constantly. They had watchtowers at strategic points. They employed local informants who would sell out their neighbors for an extra ration of bread. If anyone saw the boy tampering with the sign, if anyone reported unusual activity near that intersection, the Gestapo would descend on the village like wolves. They would line up every male over the age of 12 and start shooting until someone confessed. That was their method. That was how they maintained control. Fear was their currency, and they spent it generously. But the boy also understood something the Germans did not. He knew that the forest belonged to him, not to them. He had spent years hiking these trails, learning which paths were visible from the road and which were hidden. He knew where the patrols walked and when they changed shifts. He knew that on certain nights when the wind howled down from the peaks, even the most dedicated sentry would retreat into the warmth of a guard shack rather than freeze in the open. Those nights were his window. He chose a night in late January, when the temperature dropped below zero and a storm rolled in from the north. The wind screamed through the trees, bending them nearly double. Snow fell so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. It was the kind of night when even the Germans stayed inside when the patrols were canceled and the guard towers stood empty. The boy told his parents he was going to bed early, then slipped out through his bedroom window with a rucksack containing a wrench, a small lantern, and a knife. He moved through the village like a ghost, staying in the shadows, avoiding the main street where German soldiers sometimes gathered. Once he reached the treine, he felt safer. The forest swallowed him. The storm covered his tracks as fast as he made them. He moved quickly but carefully, following a route he had memorized during his weeks of observation. The intersection was 3 miles away through dense woods. In good weather, the hike took 45 minutes. In this storm, it took him nearly 2 hours. When he finally reached the intersection, the wind was so loud he could barely hear his own breathing. The sign stood at the fork in the road. A simple wooden post with 2 arrows, one pointing left toward safety and one pointing right toward the cliff. Both arrows were covered in snow and ice. The boy pulled out his wrench and began working on the bolts that held the sign to the post. His hands were numb within minutes. The metal was frozen. The bolts refused to turn. He worked slowly, methodically, fighting the urge to rush. If he stripped the bolts, if he broke the sign, the Germans would notice the tampering and grow suspicious. It had to look natural. It had to look like nothing had changed. After 20 minutes of struggling, the first bolt came free, then the second. He lifted the sign off the post, turned it 180 degrees, and bolted it back in place. Now the arrow that had pointed toward safety pointed toward death. The arrow that had warned away from the cliff now invited the trucks forward. He stepped back and examined his work. In the darkness and snow, it looked perfect. It looked untouched. It looked like it had always been this way. The hike back to the village was faster, because adrenaline overrode exhaustion. He reached his house before dawn, climbed back through his window, and buried his wet clothes at the bottom of his closet. When his mother woke him for breakfast, he pretended to be groggy, pretended that he had slept through the entire storm. But inside, his heart was racing. He had done it. The trap was set. Now all he could do was wait for the convoy to arrive and hope that his calculations were correct. He did not have to wait long. The Germans were nothing if not punctual. Tuesday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of brutal mountain clarity where the sky turns so blue it almost hurts to look at and every sound carries for miles. The boy woke early, his stomach twisted into knots. He could not eat breakfast. His mother asked if he was feeling sick and he lied and said he was fine, just tired from the storm. He walked to school with the other village children, but his mind was not on lessons. It was on that intersection 5 mi away, on that reversed sign standing in the snow waiting. He knew the convoy schedules. If the pattern held, the trucks would leave the coastal depot at 7 in the morning and reach the fork in the road around 9:30. He sat in his classroom staring at the clock on the wall, watching the hands crawl forward with agonizing slowness. 9 came and went. 9:15, 9:20. At 9:25 he heard it, a low rumble in the distance growing louder, the unmistakable sound of heavy diesel engines grinding up the mountain road. The teacher was writing something on the chalkboard about Norwegian history, about the kings and queens of the old days, the irony of which was not lost on the boy. Here they were, occupied and controlled, learning about a past that felt like fiction, while the present roared past their windows. The sound of the convoy grew closer. The boy could hear individual truck engines, now could hear the squeal of brakes as the vehicles navigated the tight curves. Other students began to notice. Heads turned toward the windows. The teacher stopped writing and listened. German convoys were common, but something about this one felt different. It was larger than usual. The sound went on and on, truck after truck after truck. The boy counted in his head. 10 vehicles, 15, 20. It was a major supply run, perhaps one of the biggest of the winter. His hands started to shake. He gripped the edge of his desk to steady himself. If this worked, if the sign did what he intended, he was about to kill dozens of German soldiers, maybe more. The weight of that realization hit him like a physical blow. The convoy passed through the village without stopping, a long snake of green canvas and black iron winding its way up the mountain road. The soldiers in the trucks looked bored, cold, wrapped in heavy coats, smoking cigarettes, staring at nothing. They had made this run dozens of times. It was routine. It was safe. They had no reason to suspect that a 15-year-old boy with a wrench had turned their safe route into a death sentence. The sound of the engines began to fade as the convoy climbed higher into the mountains, heading toward the intersection. The boy looked at the clock again. 9:45. The intersection was 15 minutes away at convoy speed. He felt like he was going to vomit. He wanted to run out of the classroom to sprint up the mountain and rip the sign down to stop what he had started, but he could not move. He could only sit there frozen, listening to the sound of the trucks growing fainter and fainter until they disappeared entirely into the distance. The classroom fell back into its usual rhythm. The teacher resumed the history lesson. Students opened their notebooks and pretended to care about dead kings. But the boy could not hear any of it. His mind was in the forest, watching an invisible clock count down to the moment when the lead truck would reach the fork in the road, and the driver would look at the sign and turn the wheel. He imagined it frame by frame, the truck turning, the driver realizing too late that the road was ending. The moment of panic, the scream, the fall, then the second truck following, then the third. How long would it take before one of the drivers realized what was happening? How many trucks would go over before someone hit the brakes? He did not know. He had not thought that far ahead. He had only thought about revenge, about striking back, about making the Germans pay for what they had done to his country. But now, sitting in that classroom with his heart hammering in his chest, he understood that he had just committed an act of war. The explosion, when it came, was distant, but unmistakable. A deep rolling boom that echoed through the valley, followed by another, then another. The sound was not continuous. It came in waves, each blast separated by a few seconds like fireworks at a festival, except there was nothing festive about it. The classroom went silent. Every head turned toward the windows again. The teacher's face went pale. One of the girls started crying. Everyone in that village knew what an explosion on the mountain road meant. It meant an accident. It meant death. It meant the Germans would come looking for someone to blame. The boy sat perfectly still, his face carefully neutral, even as his entire body screamed with terror and triumph. It had worked. The sign had worked. The convoy was gone. The explosions continued for nearly 10 minutes, a symphony of destruction that rolled across the mountains like thunder. Each blast was the sound of a truck hitting the rocks below, its fuel tank rupturing, its ammunition cargo detonating in a chain reaction of fire and metal. The boy sat in that classroom listening to the sound of his own handiwork. And with each new explosion, the reality of what he had done became more concrete and more terrifying. He had expected 1 or 2 trucks to go over before the convoy stopped. He had not expected this. He had not expected the entire line of vehicles to follow each other into the abyss like lemmings. Each driver trusting the truck ahead, each one assuming that if the lead vehicle turned that direction, it must be safe. The Germans, for all their military precision and discipline, had walked straight into the trap with their eyes wide open. Their reliance on order and routine had become their death sentence. Within an hour, German military vehicles began flooding into the village. They came fast and angry. Soldiers jumping out before the trucks even stopped moving, their weapons drawn, their faces twisted with rage and confusion. The villagers were ordered out of their homes at gunpoint and assembled in the village square. Women clutched their children. Old men stood with their hands raised. The boy stood with his classmates, trying to look as frightened and confused as everyone else, which was not difficult because he was genuinely terrified. An officer began shouting in broken Norwegian, demanding to know if anyone had seen anything suspicious, if anyone had been near the mountain road, if anyone had information about sabotage. The word sabotage hung in the air like a guillotine blade. The Germans knew. They had already been to the intersection. They had already seen the reversed sign. They knew this was not an accident. They knew someone in this village or one of the surrounding villages had declared war on the Reich, and they were going to find that person even if they had to burn every house to the ground. The interrogations began immediately. The Germans set up a command post in the village hall and started pulling people in one by one. They questioned the men first, the ones who might have the physical strength to climb to the intersection and change the sign. They asked about movements, about alibis, about who had been where during the storm. They brought in dogs to search for tracks leading from the village to the forest. They examined boots for mud and clothing for tears. The boy watched all of this happen from across the square, his mind racing through every detail of his journey to the intersection, trying to remember if he had left any evidence behind. He had worn his oldest boots, the ones with worn soles that left no distinctive pattern. He had buried his wet clothes. He had told no one, not even his closest friends. But the storm had been 2 nights ago. Snow had fallen since then. His tracks would be covered. The dogs would find nothing. He repeated this to himself like a prayer over and over, trying to believe it. His turn came in the late afternoon. 2 soldiers escorted him into the village hall, where a Gestapo officer sat behind a desk, smoking a cigarette and studying a map of the area. The officer was young, maybe 30, with cold blue eyes and a scar across his left cheek. He looked at the boy the way someone might look at an insect, with casual contempt and mild curiosity. The questions started simple. Name, age, where do you live? Where were you 2 nights ago? The boy answered in a quiet voice, keeping his story simple and boring. He had been home. He had gone to bed early because of the storm. His parents could confirm this. The officer wrote nothing down. He just watched the boy's face, looking for the telltale signs of lying. The dart of the eyes, the sweat on the forehead, the tremor in the hands. But the boy had trained for this without knowing it. Years of hiding in the forest, years of watching animals and learning to move without disturbing them, had taught him patience and control. He met the officer's gaze without flinching. He kept his breathing steady. He became boring. After 15 minutes of questioning, the officer waved him away with disgust. The boy was just another peasant child, too young and too stupid to pull off something this sophisticated. The Gestapo was looking for an adult, probably someone with military training, maybe a former Norwegian soldier or a resistance operative who had infiltrated the area. A 15-year-old scout was beneath suspicion. The boy walked out of the village hall on shaking legs, past the other villagers, still waiting to be questioned, and headed home. He did not run. He did not look back. He simply walked, one foot in front of the other, until he reached his house and closed the door behind him. Only then, alone in his room, did he allow himself to breathe. He had survived the first test, but he knew the Germans would not stop. They would keep searching. They would keep questioning, and sooner or later someone might remember seeing something, might put pieces together, might point a finger in his direction. He had won the battle, but the war for his own survival had just begun. The German investigation consumed the village for 3 full days. Soldiers went door to door, searching attics and cellars, looking for evidence of resistance activity. They confiscated tools that could have been used to remove the sign, wrenches and hammers, and anything metal. They photographed the boots of every male in the village, creating a catalog of sole patterns to compare against any tracks they might find. They brought in engineers to examine the reverse sign itself, checking for fingerprints, for tool marks, for any microscopic clue that might lead them to the saboteur. But the storm had done its work too well. The snow and ice had scrubbed the sign clean. The tracks leading to and from the intersection had been buried under 2 ft of fresh powder. The Germans had a crime scene. They had bodies being pulled from the ravine. They had twisted metal and burned cargo scattered across the rocks, but they had no suspects. The frustration was visible on their faces, a simmering rage that threatened to boil over into indiscriminate violence at any moment. On the 4th day, the executions began. The Germans decided that if they could not find the guilty party, they would punish the community as a whole. They selected 10 men at random from the village and the surrounding farms, lined them up against the wall of the church, and shot them in front of the entire population. The message was clear. This is the price of resistance. This is what happens when you strike at the Reich. The boy watched it happen from the crowd, forced to stand there with everyone else, forced to witness the consequences of his action. He recognized some of the men. One had been his teacher before the war. Another had worked alongside his father at the mill. They died for something they did not do. Their blood staining the snow in front of the church. And the boy had to stand there with a neutral expression, had to watch without crying, without screaming, without confessing. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, harder than changing the sign, harder than the interrogation, because now he understood the full weight of resistance. It was not just about killing the enemy. It was about carrying the burden of collateral damage, about living with the knowledge that innocent people died because of choices you made. After the executions, the German presence in the village intensified rather than diminished. They established a permanent garrison, turning the village hall into a military outpost. Patrols increased, curfews became stricter. The entire area was placed under martial law. Every resident was required to carry identity papers at all times. Random searches became daily occurrences. The boy's life shrank to a careful routine of school, home, and silence. He stopped going into the forest. He stopped meeting with the other former scouts. He became invisible, just another frightened teenager trying to survive the occupation. But at night, alone in his room, he listened to the whispers that spread through the village like wildfire. The numbers were coming in. The Germans had lost 23 trucks in the ravine. Over 70 soldiers had died in the initial fall and the subsequent explosions. Dozens more had been injured. It was one of the single largest losses the Wehrmacht had suffered in Norway during the entire occupation. The supply line to the interior had been disrupted for weeks, and no one, not the Gestapo, not the military investigators, not the informants, had any idea who was responsible. The boy began to understand that his anonymity was both his protection and his prison. He could never tell anyone what he had done. He could never claim credit. He could never share the burden of those 10 executed men with another soul. If he spoke even years later, even after the war ended, the knowledge could spread. Someone might talk. Someone might seek revenge or recognition. The Germans had long memories, and even after defeat they had collaborators and sympathizers scattered across Europe. So the secret had to die with him. He had to carry it alone through the rest of the occupation, through the liberation, through the reconstruction, through his entire life. He was 15 years old, and he had already learned the fundamental truth of underground warfare. The most effective resistance fighters are the ones whose names never appear in history books. The real heroes are the ghosts who strike and vanish, leaving only results and mysteries behind. Weeks turned into months. The winter gave way to spring. The German garrison remained, but the intensity of their search eventually faded as other priorities demanded attention. The war was not going well for the Reich. The Eastern Front was collapsing. Allied bombers were reducing German cities to rubble. The occupation forces in Norway were stretched thin, needed elsewhere, and a single act of sabotage in a remote mountain village, no matter how devastating, could not hold their attention forever. Life in the village settled into a new, harsher normal. The executed men were buried in the churchyard. Their families grieved in silence, and the boy went to school, did his chores, and pretended that he was just like everyone else. But every time a German convoy passed through the village, every time he heard the sound of truck engines on the mountain road, he felt a dark satisfaction. They were taking different routes now. They were checking every sign twice. They were afraid. And that fear, he realized, was its own kind of victory. The boy's act of sabotage rippled outward in ways he could never have anticipated. Within weeks, reports began circulating through the underground resistance network that operated in the shadows of occupied Norway. The story of the reversed sign spread from village to village, whispered in cellars, and passed along coded radio transmissions to the Norwegian government in exile in London. The resistance leadership could not believe it at first. The simplicity was almost insulting. No explosives, no weapons, no elaborate planning, just a wrench and a winter storm, and one child's understanding of geography and German arrogance. But the results were undeniable. 73 enemy soldiers dead, an entire supply convoy destroyed, a major transportation route compromised, and the Germans had no one to blame, no cell to raid, no network to dismantle. It was the perfect sabotage, and it inspired others. Across Norway, resistance fighters began looking at their own landscapes with new eyes, identifying similar opportunities where the enemy's reliance on infrastructure could be turned against them. In the months that followed, at least a dozen copycat incidents occurred throughout occupied territories. In Denmark, a teenage girl redirected a German fuel convoy into a flooded quarry. In France, railway workers switched track signals and sent a munitions train into a dead-end tunnel, where it exploded and collapsed the passage for months. In Belgium, members of the resistance repainted road markers, leading a Gestapo convoy directly into a British ambush. None of these operations had the same death toll as the original Norwegian incident, but together they represented a new form of warfare. One that required no formal military training, no access to weapons, no funding from Allied intelligence. All it required was local knowledge, patience, and the willingness to act. The boy in the Norwegian village had accidentally written a new chapter in the resistance handbook, and the Germans, despite their best efforts, could not counter it. How do you guard every traffic sign? How do you verify every road marker in an occupied continent? The answer was, you could not. The infrastructure they relied upon to control Europe had become a weapon aimed at their own throats. But while the resistance celebrated, the boy himself descended into a darkness he had not expected. The initial rush of victory faded quickly, replaced by something heavier and more complicated. He started having nightmares. In his dreams, he stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the trucks fall in slow motion, seeing the faces of the soldiers as they realized what was happening. Some of them looked terrified. Some looked confused. Some looked exactly like the boys from his village. Young men who had been drafted into a war they did not choose. He knew they were the enemy. He knew they were occupiers. He knew that every German soldier in Norway was complicit in the oppression of his people. But knowing something intellectually and living with the emotional weight of it were two different things. He had killed 73 people. He had watched 10 innocent men die because of what he did. He carried both victories and atrocities on his shoulders, and there was no one he could talk to about any of it. His behavior began to change in subtle ways that his parents noticed but could not explain. He became withdrawn, spending hours alone in his room or walking in the forest. He stopped smiling. He flinched at loud noises. When his mother asked what was wrong, he told her he was just tired of the occupation, tired of the Germans, tired of being afraid all the time. She believed him because that description fit every Norwegian teenager in 1943. What she did not see was that her son was suffering from something that would not have a name for decades, something that soldiers returning from Vietnam would eventually call post-traumatic stress. He had gone to war without leaving his village, and the war had followed him home, hiding in his thoughts, waiting for quiet moments to ambush him with memories of explosions and executions. He learned to function through it, learned to bury the trauma beneath layers of routine and normally. But it never truly went away. It became part of him, a shadow that followed him everywhere. The price of striking back at an enemy that seemed invincible. As 1943 turned into 1944, the war began to shift. The Allies landed in Normandy. The Soviet army pushed westward. The Reich, which had seemed eternal and unstoppable just 2 years earlier, started to crack. In Norway, the occupation forces grew nervous, more brutal in some ways, more desperate in others. They knew they were losing. They knew the end was coming. But they held on with savage determination, and the boy watched and waited, wondering if he would live to see liberation, or if the Germans would kill him in some final spasm of violence before they retreated. He had survived this long by being invisible, by keeping his secret locked away, by appearing to be nothing more than a frightened teenager, counting the days until freedom. But inside, where no one could see, he was still standing at that intersection in the snow, still turning that sign, still sending those trucks over the edge over and over again forever. Liberation came to Norway in May of 1945, not with a dramatic battle, but with a quiet collapse. The German forces, cut off from Berlin and surrounded by Allied advances on all fronts, simply surrendered. One day, the village was occupied. The next day, the soldiers were laying down their weapons and waiting to be processed as prisoners of war. The Norwegian flag, hidden in attics and cellars for 5 long years, reappeared on every building. People flooded into the streets, crying and embracing, celebrating the end of a nightmare that had consumed their lives. The boy stood in that crowd, watching the Germans march away under guard. And he felt nothing. No joy, no relief, no sense of victory. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times during the occupation, imagined how it would feel to watch the enemy leave. But now that it was happening, all he felt was emptiness. The war was over, but the war inside him would never end. He had killed for his country. He had watched innocent people die because of his actions. And now everyone around him was celebrating as if none of it had cost anything, as if freedom had simply arrived like a gift rather than being purchased in blood and guilt. In the weeks after liberation, the resistance came out of the shadows. Men and women who had fought in secret for years suddenly had names and faces and stories. The government in exile returned from London. Medals were distributed. Ceremonies were held. The heroes of the Norwegian resistance were celebrated in newspapers and on radio broadcasts, their exploits documented and mythologized. But the boy's name never appeared in any of those stories. The incident with the convoy, while known within resistance circles, remained officially unattributed. The Norwegian authorities had their reasons for this silence. First, the saboteur had never come forward to claim responsibility, which made verification impossible. Second, the execution of the 10 villagers complicated the narrative. How do you celebrate an act of resistance that resulted in German reprisals against civilians? It was easier to let the story fade into ambiguity, to acknowledge that something had happened without dwelling on the messy details of who did it and what it cost. And third, there was the matter of age. If the rumors were true, if the person responsible really was a teenage boy, then admitting it meant admitting that Norway had sent children to war, which was not the image the new government wanted to project to the world. The boy himself had no interest in coming forward. He watched the celebration of other resistance fighters with a mixture of respect and distance. He understood that they deserved recognition for their bravery, but he also understood that his own story was different. What he had done was not heroic in the traditional sense. It was not a fair fight. It was not soldiers against soldiers. It was a child with a wrench committing mass murder through deception, and 10 innocent men had paid the price for it. There was no way to tell that story that made anyone feel good. So he stayed silent. When his father asked if he had heard about the mysterious sabotage that had killed all those Germans, the boy shrugged and said he had heard rumors, but did not know the details. When his friends speculated about who might have been responsible, he participated in the speculation, throwing out theories like everyone else, hiding in plain sight. The secret that had protected him during the occupation continued to protect him after liberation. But now it was a different kind of protection. Now it was protecting him from uncomfortable questions and moral complexity, and the burden of being called a hero for something that felt more like a sin. Years passed. The village rebuilt. The executed men were memorialized with a plaque in the church. The boy finished school, took a job, got married, had children of his own. He lived a quiet life, the kind of life that millions of Europeans lived after the war, trying to forget the horrors and move forward into a future that seemed impossibly fragile. He never spoke about what he had done, not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. The secret became so deeply buried that sometimes he could almost convince himself it had happened to someone else, that the boy who climbed through the snow and reversed that sign was a different person entirely. But every year on the anniversary of that January morning, he would wake from the same nightmare, the sound of trucks falling and exploding echoing through his mind, and he would know that the past was not past, that it was still there, waiting, patient as a predator. The true scale of what he had accomplished remained hidden for decades. The German military records captured by the Allies at the end of the war were sealed in archives and slowly declassified over the following 50 years. It was not until the 1990s that historians combing through those documents discovered the full report of the incident. The convoy had been carrying more than just supplies. It had been transporting gold bullion stolen from Norwegian banks destined for Berlin to help fund the collapsing war effort. It had been carrying classified documents detailing German defensive positions along the coast. It had been carrying a high-ranking SS officer who was traveling to inspect security arrangements at a nearby labor camp. The boy had not just killed 73 soldiers. He had disrupted a major financial transfer, compromised military intelligence, and eliminated a key figure in the occupation's command structure. By any strategic measure, it was one of the most successful single acts of sabotage in the entire Norwegian resistance. And the person responsible had been 15 years old, had used no explosives, had required no outside support, and had never told a soul. The boy, now an old man in his 70s, learned about the declassified documents by accident. It was 1997, and he was living in a small apartment in Oslo, retired from a lifetime of unremarkable work. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier. His children had moved to other cities, busy with their own lives. He spent his days reading newspapers and taking walks along the fjord, a routine that gave shape to the loneliness. One afternoon, while browsing a bookstore, he came across a new history of the Norwegian resistance, thick and heavily footnoted, the kind of academic work that most people would find dry. But something on the back cover caught his eye. A brief mention of unresolved sabotage incidents, including a mysterious convoy disaster in 1943. He bought the book and took it home, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the pages. When he reached the chapter about his village, about that January morning, he had to sit down. The historians had pieced together more than he ever knew. They had the German after-action reports. They had casualty lists. They had descriptions of the cargo. They had even interviewed some of the surviving German soldiers decades later, men who had been in vehicles further back in the convoy and had watched the trucks ahead disappear over the cliff. The book called it one of the great mysteries of the occupation. Who had done it? The authors had theories. Maybe it was a team of British commandos. Maybe it was a sleeper agent from the Soviet intelligence network. Maybe it was a coordinated resistance cell that had been wiped out in the subsequent German crackdown. Their identities lost forever. The possibility that it might have been a single teenager acting alone did not even appear in the speculation. It was too improbable, too simple. The authors spent pages analyzing the strategic implications, praising the unknown saboteur's understanding of German logistics and psychology, building up a phantom operative who existed only in their imaginations. The old man read it all with a strange mixture of pride and sadness. They had gotten the facts right, but the story completely wrong. There had been no commandos, no spy networks, no master plan. There had only been a frightened boy with a wrench and a desire to hurt the people who had hurt his country. Everything else, all the strategic brilliance they attributed to the act, had been luck and geography and German overconfidence. He considered, for the first time in 50 years, telling someone the truth. He could write a letter to the historians. He could contact the Norwegian Resistance Museum. He could finally step out of the shadows and claim his place in history. But every time he reached for a pen, he stopped. What would be the point? The war had been over for half a century. Most of the people who had lived through it were dead. His story would be interesting for a few weeks, maybe generate some newspaper articles, maybe earn him an invitation to speak at a memorial service. But it would also reopen old wounds. The families of the 10 executed men still lived in that village. Their grandchildren played in the same streets where their ancestors had been shot. How would they feel learning that their relatives had died because of a teenager's act of sabotage? Would they understand? Would they forgive? Or would they hate him for staying silent all these years, for letting them believe their loved ones had been victims of random German brutality rather than calculated reprisal? He could not predict their reaction, and the uncertainty kept him silent. There was also the matter of the German soldiers. 73 men had died that morning, and while they had been the enemy, while they had been part of an occupying force that committed atrocities across Europe, they had also been human beings. Some of them had probably been Nazis, true believers in the Reich's twisted ideology. But others had probably been conscripts, farm boys, and factory workers who had been drafted and sent to Norway against their will. The old man had spent decades trying not to think about this distinction, trying to maintain the clear moral line that had justified his action as a boy. But the older he got, the more that line blurred. He had killed people. The fact that it was war, the fact that they were occupiers, the fact that his country had been suffering under their rule. None of that changed the fundamental reality. He had taken lives, many lives, and some of those lives had probably belonged to people who were not that different from him. Young men who had found themselves on the wrong side of history through no fault of their own. The book sat on his shelf for months, a physical reminder of the choice he faced. Tell the truth and become a footnote in history, or take the secret to his grave and let the mystery remain unsolved. In the end, the decision was made for him by his failing health. He suffered a stroke in the winter of 1998, a major one that left him partially paralyzed and struggling to speak. His children moved him into a nursing home where he spent his final year drifting in and out of consciousness. His mind caught between the present and the past. Sometimes he thought he was 15 again, climbing through the snow with a wrench in his backpack. Sometimes he thought he was in the classroom listening to the explosions echo across the valley. And sometimes in his clearest moments he understood that he was an old man dying with a secret that would die with him. And that perhaps that was how it should be. Not every hero needs recognition. Not every act of war needs to be celebrated. Some things are better left in the fog, mysterious and unresolved, known only to the person who lived them and the ghosts who haunt their memory. The old man died in March of 1999, alone in his nursing home room on a rainy afternoon. His children arrived too late, caught in traffic, and by the time they reached his bedside, he was already gone. There was no deathbed confession, no final revelation, no last-minute decision to unburden himself of the secret he had carried for 56 years. He simply stopped breathing, and the truth went with him. His funeral was small and quiet, attended by family and a handful of elderly neighbors who remembered him as a decent man, a hard worker, someone who kept to himself but was always polite. The priest spoke about faith and resilience and the generation that had survived the war. Generic phrases that could have applied to any Norwegian of that age. No one mentioned resistance. No one mentioned heroism. No one had any idea that they were burying one of the most effective saboteurs in Norwegian history. He was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in the fjord, dissolving into the same cold water that had reflected the smoke from burning German trucks 56 years earlier. His children, while going through his belongings, found the book about the resistance sitting on his shelf. They flipped through it, noticed that he had dog-eared certain pages, underlined certain passages, all relating to the Convoy incident near their father's childhood village. They found this curious, but not extraordinary. Many people who had lived through the occupation were interested in resistance history. It was natural that their father would want to read about events that had happened near his home. They donated the book to a local library along with the rest of his collection, and thought nothing more of it. The secret, so carefully guarded, nearly survived intact. But secrets have a strange way of leaking even after death, especially when they involve documentation. The old man had kept something that his children did not find, something he had hidden years earlier in a place he thought was safe, but which he had forgotten in the fog of his declining mind. In 2003, 4 years after his death, the apartment building where he had lived for 30 years was demolished to make way for new construction. During the demolition, workers tearing out the old radiators in what had been his unit found a small metal box wedged behind the heating pipes, covered in rust and dust. Inside the box was a diary, handwritten in Norwegian, dated 1943. The construction foreman, thinking it might be historically significant, turned it over to the Oslo Museum of Cultural History, rather than throwing it away with the rest of the debris. The museum catalogued it and filed it away, one more artifact among thousands, where it sat unread for another 6 years. It was not until 2009, when a graduate student researching daily life during the occupation requested access to personal documents from that period, that anyone actually opened the diary and read what was inside. The entries were sparse, just a few sentences here and there, the writing of a teenager who was not naturally inclined toward journaling. Most of it was mundane. Complaints about the cold, descriptions of rationing, observations about German patrols. But then, dated January 19, 1943, there was an entry that made the graduate student's breath catch in her throat. The handwriting was shakier than the other entries, as if written by someone whose hands were trembling. It read in Norwegian, translated here to English. I did it last night. Changed the sign at the fork. The storm covered my tracks. No one saw me. This morning, the convoy came. I heard the explosions from school. So many explosions, more than I thought. They are questioning everyone now. 10 men were shot today because of what I did. I do not know if I am a hero or a murderer. I do not know if God will forgive me. I do not know if I will ever sleep again without hearing those sounds. But they are dead. 73 of them are dead. And I am alive and I will never tell. The graduate student brought the diary to her faculty advisor, who brought it to the museum director, who brought it to a panel of historians specializing in World War II and the Norwegian resistance. They examined the diary for authenticity, checking the paper, the ink, the handwriting consistency across all entries. They cross-referenced the dates and details with known historical events. They tracked down the old man's family and obtained DNA samples to compare against saliva residue on the diary's pages. Every test confirmed what the diary claimed. It was genuine. The mystery that had puzzled historians for 66 years had been solved by a forgotten journal hidden behind a radiator. The unknown saboteur finally had a name, an identity, a human face. The boy who had reversed the sign was real, and he had been exactly what the historians thought was impossible. A 15-year-old scout acting entirely alone, driven by nothing more than anger and opportunity, and the kind of reckless courage that only comes from youth. The revelation of the diary created a firestorm in Norwegian historical circles and beyond. Within weeks, the story had spread from academic journals to international news outlets. Major newspapers in London, New York, Paris, and Berlin ran features about the Boy Scout who had single-handedly decimated a German convoy using nothing but a wrench and local knowledge. Documentary filmmakers began calling the museum, requesting access to the diary and permission to interview the man's surviving family. The Norwegian government, which had unknowingly overlooked one of its greatest resistance heroes for over 6 decades, scrambled to correct the historical record. They added his name to the National Resistance Memorial in Oslo. They issued Eostomus Medal, the War Cross with Sword, the highest military decoration Norway awards for exceptional bravery. His children, now elderly themselves and stunned by the discovery, were invited to the royal palace where the King of Norway personally apologized for the decades of silence and thanked them for their father's sacrifice. It was a moment of national pride and collective guilt, a recognition that the most extraordinary acts of courage sometimes come from the most unlikely sources and are often hidden in plain sight for generations. But the story also reignited painful debates about the nature of resistance and the cost of fighting tyranny. The families of the 10 executed villagers, descendants now 3 generations removed from the events, had mixed reactions. Some expressed pride that their ancestors had unwittingly died as part of a successful military operation against the occupiers. Others expressed anger that they had spent their entire lives believing their relatives had been murdered for nothing, when in reality, they had been killed in reprisal for an act of sabotage that had never been claimed or acknowledged. Online forums and newspaper comment sections filled with arguments about whether the boys' action had been justified, whether the death of 10 innocents was an acceptable price for killing 73 enemy soldiers, whether a 15-year-old could truly understand the consequences of such a decision. The debate was heated and often vicious, reflecting deeper disagreements about war, morality, and the impossible choices that occupation forces upon ordinary people. Some called him a hero. Some called him a murderer. Most recognized that he was both. That war creates situations where heroism and atrocity become inseparable, where the same act can be simultaneously noble and horrific depending on which side of the cliff you are standing on. The diary itself became a touring exhibit displayed in museums across Norway and eventually in other countries that had experienced Nazi occupation. People lined up for hours to see the small rust-stained journal to read the shaky handwriting of a traumatized teenager processing an act of violence that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The entry about the execution of the 10 villagers was particularly powerful, a raw admission of guilt and confusion that contrasted sharply with the triumphant narratives usually associated with resistance stories. Educators began using the diary in schools as a teaching tool, not to glorify war or violence, but to illustrate the complexity of moral decision-making under extreme circumstances. Students were asked to put themselves in the boys' position, to consider what they would have done, to grapple with the reality that sometimes there are no good choices, only terrible ones and slightly less terrible ones. The diary became a reminder that history is not clean, that heroes are not perfect, and that the people who fight for freedom often carry scars that never fully heal. Perhaps the most unexpected consequence of the diary's discovery was its impact on historical methodology itself. The incident proved that even in the most documented conflict in human history, even in a war where millions of pages of records were kept and preserved, enormous gaps still existed. How many other acts of resistance had gone unrecorded? How many other heroes had taken their secrets to the grave? How many stories had been lost because the people who lived them were too traumatized, too humble, or too afraid to tell? The Norwegian resistance archives were reopened and re-examined with fresh eyes. Historians began actively seeking out hidden diaries, forgotten letters, and obscure family documents that might contain similar revelations. The search expanded to other occupied countries, and slowly more stories began to emerge. A Belgian school teacher who had hidden Allied pilots in her attic for 3 years. A French railway worker who had sabotaged hundreds of locomotives through subtle mechanical failures. A Polish nun who had smuggled Jewish children out of the Warsaw Ghetto disguised as typhus victims. Each story had been invisible to history, preserved only in private documents that had been stored away and forgotten. The boy's diary had opened a door. And behind that door was an entire hidden dimension of the war, populated by ordinary people who had done extraordinary things and then vanished back into anonymity. Today, 75 years after that January morning in 1943, the story of the Boy Scout and the reversed traffic sign has become part of Norwegian national memory, taught in schools and commemorated in monuments. A plaque now stands at the intersection where he changed the sign, marking the spot where one teenager's act of defiance killed more enemy soldiers than some entire resistance operations. But the real legacy of his story is not the body count or the strategic impact. The real legacy is the reminder that resistance does not always come from trained soldiers or intelligence operatives or political leaders. Sometimes it comes from children. Sometimes it comes from people who have no business being at war, but who find themselves in the middle of one anyway and decide that doing nothing is not an option. The boy with the wrench proved that you do not need an army to fight tyranny. You just need courage, opportunity, and the willingness to live with the consequences of your actions for the rest of your life. His story was buried for decades, forgotten by everyone except the ghosts that haunted his dreams. But now it lives on as a testament to the power of individual action and the price of freedom. And maybe, just maybe, that is exactly what he would have wanted to be remembered, not as a hero or a killer, but as a reminder that even in the darkest times, even when the enemy seems invincible, there is always someone willing to stand up and fight back. No matter how young, no matter how scared, no matter the